It began like any other morning in a peaceful Colorado neighborhood. The sun was rising, the streets were quiet, and the world outside still seemed normal. But behind the closed doors of one home, something was terribly wrong. A young mother, Shanann Watts, and her two daughters had vanished without a trace. Her car was still in the garage, her shoes were by the door, and yet no one answered the phone. As friends began to worry and the police arrived to check on her, no one knew that the man standing at the front porch, her husband, was already hiding a dark, unthinkable truth. Colorado is often called one of the best places to live in America. Clean air, endless mountains, and quiet suburban neighborhoods that feel like something out of a dream. The town of Frederick, where the Watts family lived, was one of those picture-perfect places. Wide streets, two-story homes with neat front lawns, and neighbors who waved at each other every morning. Everything looked peaceful. Almost too perfect, but sometimes, behind perfection, there are cracks no one wants to see. Shanann Watts was a woman who smiled through pain. Born in 1984 in New Jersey, she had struggled with lupus, a chronic autoimmune disease that causes fatigue and discomfort. But Shanann didn't let that stop her. She worked hard, built her own life, and even bought her first home on her own. She took pride in her strength, and that strength was part of what drew people to her, especially online. Shanann was extremely active on Facebook. Almost every day, she posted something new. Pictures of her children, moments from dinner with her husband, videos where she talked about her job or shared her thoughts. She was in network marketing, and she used her platform to promote health products, but more than that, she built a personal brand. In her videos, she called her husband the best man in the world. She praised how he helped care for her during illness, how he made breakfast for their daughters, how lucky she was to have him. Chris Watts, her husband, seemed like a quiet, caring man. He worked in the oil and gas industry, kept to himself, and stayed out of the spotlight. Together they had two daughters, Bella, age 4, and Celeste, nicknamed CC, who was 3. The girls were adorable, with wide eyes and sweet grins. In every photo, Shanann was at the center, holding her children close. Chris stood nearby, calm and steady. When Shanann became pregnant again, this time with a boy, she shared the news with a playful video. Her shirt read, "Oops, we did it again." Chris smiled for the camera and hugged her, pretending to be surprised. To the outside world, they were living the modern American dream. Young family, stable jobs, a beautiful house in a growing community, but there was something Shanann didn't post online, something she kept to herself. A change, subtle at first, had started to grow in her marriage. Chris wasn't the same. He stopped hugging her in the mornings, he stayed out later. Some nights he sat silently, staring at his phone. Shanann started to feel distant, even though they lived under the same roof. She messaged her friends saying, "Chris is Chris anymore, I don't recognize him, I feel abandoned." But she didn't give up. Shanann was a fighter, especially when it came to her family. In the summer of 2018, Shanann and the girls flew to North Carolina to visit her family for 6 weeks. Chris stayed in Colorado to work. It was the longest they'd ever been apart. And during those weeks, the distance between them grew. Chris barely called. His messages were short and cold. He didn't ask about the baby. One day, Shanann sent him a long letter. In it, she poured her heart out, reminding him of their memories, asking if he still loved her. Chris didn't answer clearly, but he was already showing his answer in another way, one that Shanann didn't know. While she was away, he started seeing another woman, a coworker from his job. They had dinner dates, took weekend trips, and Chris told her he was about to get divorced. He painted himself as a man stuck in a loveless marriage, finally ready to start a new life. But at home, he still acted like nothing had changed. He still smiled for pictures. He still called Shanann babe. When Shanann returned to Colorado on August 13th, after a short business trip to Arizona, she expected Chris to pick her up from the airport. He didn't. She arrived home around 2 a.m. Quietly while the rest of the neighborhood slept. No one knows exactly what happened inside that house after she walked through the door, but by morning everything had changed. Shanann didn't answer her phone. She didn't respond to texts. Her Facebook, usually so active, was silent. Her friend Nicole noticed right away. Nicole called and called, no answer. She drove to the Watts house and felt a chill the moment she stepped out of her car. Shannon's vehicle was still in the garage. Inside were the children's car seats, untouched. Her purse was in the kitchen. Her medication, phone, and keys were all left behind, but no one was home. Bella, Celeste, and Shanann were missing. Nicole called the police. Chris came home shortly after. He seemed worried on the surface, but something was off. He let the officers in, showed them around the house, but his answers felt rehearsed. His eyes didn't match his words. He looked down a lot, mumbled, and when the officers asked him to explain what happened that morning, there were gaps. By that moment, it was already over. There would be no more smiling Facebook posts. No more videos calling Chris the perfect husband. Everything that once looked like love was now just a thin coat of paint covering a broken foundation. And at the center of it all was a woman trying to hold her family together, while the man she trusted most was quietly turning away from her. August 13, 2018, a Monday morning like any other in the small town of Frederick, Colorado. But for Nicole Atkinson, something didn't feel right. She woke up uneasy. Shanann Watts, her best friend, had not responded to any of her texts, and for someone as active and organized as Shanann, that was deeply unusual. Nicole had just seen her hours earlier, the night before around 1:48 a.m. Nicole had dropped Shanann off at home after a work trip to Arizona. Shanann was tired but seemed fine. She had been looking forward to sleeping in her own bed and hugging her daughters, Bella and Celeste, first thing in the morning. She was also 14 weeks pregnant with her third child, a baby boy she and Chris had already decided to name Nico. But that morning everything was wrong. Nicole texted, no answer. She called, it rang, then went to voicemail. She checked Shannon's calendar. There was a prenatal appointment scheduled for 10 a.m., but as the hour approached, Shanann still hadn't responded. Worried, Nicole drove to the Watts home on Saratoga Trail. She parked outside, waiting for signs of life. The house was still, silent. The front door was locked, no movement inside. She walked to the garage windows. Shannon's white Lexus was parked inside. The children's car seats were in place. That meant she hadn't driven anywhere, so where was she? Nicole called Chris. His voice was calm, almost too calm. He said Shanann had told him she was taking the girls to a friend's house that morning for a playdate, but that didn't add up. Her car was still here, her purse, her phone, all left behind. Something was terribly wrong. At 12:10 p.m., Nicole made a decision. She called the police. My friend is pregnant. She was supposed to be at a doctor's appointment this morning and she didn't show up. Her car's here, the kids' car seats are in the car, her purse is here. She's diabetic too, so I'm really worried something happened to her. Shortly after, Officer Scott Coonrod arrived at the home. Nicole was waiting outside, pacing. She led him around the house, pointing out the locked doors and the garage. Chris soon pulled into the driveway. He exited his truck casually. No panic, no urgency. He greeted them calmly and unlocked the house. They entered through the front door. Inside, everything was neat and quiet. The main floor showed no signs of a struggle. In the kitchen, Shannon's purse was still on the counter. Her phone was later found between the cushions of the couch. Upstairs, her suitcase from the Arizona trip was still sitting in the bedroom. Her makeup bag was open. Nothing looked packed or missing. Her shoes were by the stairs, untouched. It looked like she had simply vanished, but people don't just vanish. Chris offered explanations. Maybe she left with a friend. Maybe she just needed space. Maybe she took the girls to a park, but Nicole wasn't buying it. Neither was Officer Coonrod. The officer asked questions. Chris answered, but his answers were vague. His voice was flat. He didn't ask many questions in return. He didn't seem like a man desperate to find his pregnant wife and two small children. Nicole watched him carefully, so did the officer. By that afternoon, Chris agreed to let police search the house. A missing person report was filed, and now the story began to spread. Shanann Watts, age 34, and her two daughters, Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3, were officially missing. She was 15 weeks pregnant. Her phone, keys, and car were all left behind. Her best friend had called in the report, and her husband, Chris Watts, was the last person to see her alive. News vans showed up by the evening. Neighbors peeked from their windows. Some gave interviews saying the Watts family seemed like the perfect couple, but behind the scenes, things were moving fast. At the Frederick Police Department, detectives began reviewing surveillance footage. One neighbor, Nate, had a camera pointed directly across the street. It captured the Watts home clearly. That morning, the footage showed something strange. At 5:17 a.m., Chris Watts' truck backed into the garage. It sat there for several minutes. Then Chris is seen walking back and forth between the garage and the driveway, multiple trips, alone, no sign of Shanann, no sign of the children. When officers showed the footage to Chris and the neighbor, Nate watched his reaction closely. After Chris left the room, Nate turned to police and said, "He's not acting right. He never talks this much." Chris's voice had changed. He was talking too much, giving too many details, almost as if he were trying to convince them or himself. The detectives took notes and they made a request. Would Chris come in for an interview? He agreed. On August 14th, Chris Watts sat in an interview room at the police station. He looked tired, maybe even scared, but still, he stuck to his story. Shanann had come home late the night before. They had a civil conversation. She told him she was taking the girls to a friend's house. He left for work around 5:15 a.m. and that was it. But detectives weren't satisfied. They wanted more. They asked Chris to take a polygraph test. He agreed again. On August 15th, Chris returned to the station. The test was conducted by a skilled examiner named Tammy Lee. Before they even started, she told him clearly, "Chris, this polygraph is not like the movies. It's very accurate. If you did something to your family, it's better to be honest now, because this test will know." The test lasted hours. Chris sat still. He answered each question. Afterward, he was told plainly, "You failed the test." The tension in the room shifted. Chris leaned back in his chair. He was silent. Detectives pushed harder. They reminded him of the stakes, that his pregnant wife and daughters were still missing, that the public was watching, that this was his moment to speak the truth. Chris paused. He wiped his face. Then he said softly, "Can I talk to my dad?" It was a strange moment, not a confession, not yet, but a crack in the mask. The detectives agreed. His father, Ronnie Watts, came into the room. Alone with his dad, Chris finally spoke the words that changed everything. Inside the interview room at the Frederick Police Department, the tension was unbearable. The hum of the overhead light seemed louder now, the walls tighter, the air thinner. Chris Watts sat in the small chair, facing his father, Ronnie. His voice was low, almost a whisper, the kind of voice people use when they're about to say something they never thought they would. Ronnie leaned closer, unsure of what was coming. Chris said softly, "I cheated on her." Ronnie didn't flinch. He nodded slowly. This was already known, but then Chris continued, "I hurt her." That's when everything shifted. Chris's face went pale, his lips trembled, his hands clenched. His father, confused but still gentle, asked, "What do you mean, son?" Chris looked down at the floor. His eyes didn't meet his father's. His next words came out halting, broken, and quiet. She hurt the kids, and then I lost it." It was the first version of his confession. Chris told his father that Shanann had strangled Bella and Celeste, and in a fit of rage, he had then killed her. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. He just said it like a man who had rehearsed it in his mind, as if he thought that version of the story might somehow be more acceptable. But the detectives knew. They'd seen enough, heard enough, and watched enough human behavior to understand. This wasn't the truth, it was a defense. They re-entered the room. Tammy Leigh, the polygraph examiner, now had a different tone, softer, calmer. She told Chris she appreciated him opening up, but they needed to know everything. Not the version that protected him, the real story. Agent Graham Coder joined her using a similar strategy. No yelling, no threats, just steady, direct questions. Bit by bit, they walked him through the timeline again. Chris sat silently for long stretches. His body language was closed off, his hands on his lap. He wouldn't say more, not yet, so the detectives changed tactics. They asked about where his family was now. Chris paused. Then he said quietly, out of field, at the oil site. It was a bombshell, the first time he admitted that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were no longer alive, and he knew exactly where they were. The detectives asked for details. Chris hesitated, then said it. He had buried Shanann near two large oil tanks. The girls had been placed in the tanks. The room fell quiet. No one spoke for a long moment. The detectives glanced at each other. Chris stared at the floor. Even with all the suspicions, even with the failed polygraph, even with the strange behavior, this part hurt deeply, because now it was no longer about possibility. It was real. Early the next morning, law enforcement drove Chris out to the oil site, Anadarko Petroleum property, where Chris worked. It was a remote, dry location, flat land dotted with industrial tanks and machinery. Chris pointed out where he had buried Shanann, wrapped in a sheet. Then, with less emotion than anyone expected, he told them he had lifted the girls, Bella and Celeste, up to the tops of two separate oil tanks, opened the hatch, and placed them inside. The air in the vehicle went still. Even the agents had to pause. They weren't just investigators anymore. They were humans, parents, uncles, brothers. What they were hearing was beyond what most could process, but now they had answers. Now they could begin recovery. The site was secured. Forensic teams were called. Special equipment was needed to remove the children's bodies from inside the oil tanks carefully, respectfully. It would take days. The oil had damaged the evidence. But eventually the family was brought home. As news broke of the confession, the country reacted with horror. People who had watched Chris's TV interviews where he pleaded for his family to come back now saw them in a different light. The quiet demeanor, the dry eyes, the lack of urgency. It wasn't sadness, it was performance, and the performance was over. Across social media, the story exploded. Mothers cried, fathers clenched their fists. People who had never met the Watts family suddenly felt grief, confusion, rage. How could this happen? Why would a man kill his pregnant wife and children? That question haunted everyone, and slowly the truth began to unravel. Chris's affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger came to light. They had met at work and started a relationship just weeks before Shannon's murder. Chris had told her he was in the process of separating. He painted Shanann as controlling, distant, even abusive. He wanted a new life, and he wanted it now. In his mind, divorce wasn't an option. That would damage his reputation, split finances, disappoint his family. And Shanann, known for being strong, outspoken, and deeply committed, would never go down without a fight. So Chris took the most permanent, brutal way out. The case gripped the nation. People posted tribute videos, theories, breakdowns of his interviews, analyses of his body language. Facebook pages dedicated to Shanann flooded with photos and condolences, but not everyone responded with anger. Some corners of the internet began to romanticize Chris, calling him handsome, misunderstood, a good guy who snapped. These disturbing fan responses shocked the public and the Watts family even more. Ronnie and Cindy Watts, Chris's parents, were torn apart. They struggled between grief and disbelief. They had lost their granddaughters, their daughter-in-law, and now their son, who they had raised, protected, and loved, was at the center of one of America's most horrifying family murders. Meanwhile, Shannon's family, Frank and Sandy Arzusek, mourned not just their daughter but their grandchildren. 3 lives lost in the most unimaginable way. In court documents, phone records, text messages, and surveillance footage, a picture began to form. Chris was not a man who snapped in a moment of rage. He planned it. He told no one. He smiled in selfies. He took his daughters to birthday parties just days before. He even texted Shanann with hearts the night before he killed her. It was cold, calculated, and deeply chilling. On August 21, 2018, Chris Watts was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each family member. 2 additional counts for the deaths of the children under 12 by a person in a position of trust. 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy. 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The trial would not go forward. Chris pleaded guilty to all charges on November 6, 2018. He was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, to be served consecutively, plus 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shannon's pregnancy and 36 years for the tampering charges. He would never walk free again, but for many, justice could never be enough. The story of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico wasn't just a headline. It was a story of trust broken, of love betrayed, of innocence destroyed. And as the world watched, one question remained: how could a father do this? In the quiet of his prison cell, Chris Watts sits alone. Day after day, hour after hour, there is nothing left to distract him. No phone to check, no children to hug, no life to maintain, only silence and memory. It is here in the stillness that the world begins to ask, what kind of man murders his entire family? And more importantly, why, from the outside, Chris Watts looked like the perfect man. A good job, a nice house, 2 adorable daughters. A beautiful wife and a baby on the way. His neighbors called him polite. Coworkers called him quiet and reliable. He mowed his lawn, he smiled in photos, he played with his children. He said, "I love you" in text messages to Shanann, but behind this calm, smiling mask, something darker was growing. Chris was not someone who snapped. He didn't act in a moment of rage. There were no obvious signs of abuse. No criminal record, no major outbursts. What happened on August 13, 2018 was not a single moment of madness. It was the final chapter of a secret transformation. To understand his crime, we have to understand what was happening inside him long before the murders. Chris grew up quiet, described by teachers as shy, not one to make trouble. He kept things to himself. He followed rules. He stayed invisible, but deep inside, that kind of personality often comes with something else, a need to be accepted at all costs, to never disappoint, to be seen as good, even if you're not. This kind of person doesn't express anger outwardly. They suppress it, they hide it, they smile through it, until it grows in silence, feeding on resentment, confusion, and fear. They don't speak, they act. And when they act, it's often catastrophic. Chris had learned how to be what people wanted. At work, he was dependable. At home, he was helpful. In photos, he was happy. But under the surface, his real feelings were buried. And when people bury their feelings for too long, they lose the ability to understand them. Chris became emotionally numb. Shanann was strong, vocal, and organized. She built her life around her family. Her Facebook was filled with pictures and posts of love. She supported Chris through weight loss, encouraged him to connect with their kids more, and often spoke publicly about how proud she was of him. But Chris began to drift, quietly. Silently, he didn't complain, he didn't argue, he detached. Instead of confronting his problems, he avoided them. He stopped communicating, he pulled away emotionally. And when he met someone new, Nicole Kessinger, he saw a path that felt lighter, freer, easier. Nicole didn't know the full story. She thought he was already separating. She thought he was a man finally choosing his own happiness. To Chris, this was a fantasy escape, a life without conflict, a life without responsibility, a life without Shanann. Here's the key part of Chris Watts' psychology. He needed to control how others saw him. That's why he lied so easily. That's why he smiled in interviews after the murders. That's why he hid everything until the very last second. He wanted to be seen as the victim, even when he was the one destroying everything. He didn't want the shame of divorce. He didn't want to be seen as a failure. He didn't want his family or coworkers to know who he really was becoming. In his twisted mind, killing his family was a way to erase the problem without facing it. It was final, it was brutal, but it was quiet. No arguments, no divorce court, no custody battles, just gone. In psychology, there is a term, family annihilator. It describes a person, usually a father, who kills their entire family. They're not always violent in the traditional sense. In fact, most have no criminal record. They often do it in private. No warning signs, no gunshots in public. Just silence behind closed doors. Why? Because they feel trapped. They see their family not as loved ones, but as a symbol of failure, responsibility, or fear. There are four main types of family annihilators. Self-righteous, blaming the partner for the breakdown and wanting to punish them. Disappointed, believing the family failed to live up to ideals. Anomic, when the family's status reflects the father's identity and losing it threatens his ego. Paranoid, thinking the world is a threat to his family, so he protects them through death. Chris Watts doesn't perfectly fit just one, but he shows signs of both the self-righteous and anomic types. He blamed Shanann subtly for his own unhappiness. He saw her as controlling, he saw himself as trapped, and he feared losing the image of being a good man. He wanted to keep his new relationship and erase the old life without confrontation. And so he planned. After the murders, Chris was disturbingly calm. He gave TV interviews pleading for his family to return, knowing they were already dead. He texted friends, he went to work, he made small talk. This isn't just cold, it shows emotional detachment. Chris wasn't psychotic, he didn't hear voices, but he lacked empathy. He had trained himself for years to suppress emotion, to avoid conflict, to lie with a smile. When the murders were done, he simply moved on. He didn't rush to confess. He didn't break down in guilt. He waited until the evidence cornered him. One question still echoes: why didn't he just walk away? Why didn't he get a divorce, start a new life, and leave his children alive? The answer is haunting. Because Chris Watts couldn't handle conflict. Because he couldn't admit failure. Because he wanted a new life without the mess of the old one. And because deep inside he believed this was the only way to escape without looking like the villain. Of course, he was wrong. And now the entire world knows him not as a loving father or a victim of circumstance, but as a man who chose silence over truth, control over compassion, and destruction over dignity. Chris Watts is not a mystery. He is not a monster from a movie. He is a reminder that darkness can live behind the brightest smiles, that silence can hide the most violent storms, that love, when twisted by fear, ego, and control, can turn into something deadly. He didn't look like a killer, he didn't act like one, but the truth was there all along, buried beneath years of pretending. There are some stories that end with silence, and then there are those that echo for years. Shanann Watts was 34 years old when her life was taken. She was vibrant, strong, fiercely devoted to her daughters, Bella and Celeste. A soon-to-be mother again, carrying a baby boy she had already named Nico. She documented her life with love, videos of bedtime songs, family dinners, first steps. Her social media pages were filled with hope, with gratitude, with dreams for the future. And then it all stopped, but Shanann's voice didn't disappear. In the weeks and months after the tragedy, Shannan's parents, Frank and Sandy Arzusek, stepped forward into a storm no parent should ever face. They didn't seek fame, they didn't want revenge, they wanted truth and dignity and remembrance. They wanted the world to know who Shanann truly was, beyond the headlines, beyond the accusations, beyond the courtroom. Shanann was not too controlling. She was a protector, a planner, a woman who worked hard to create joy in her home, even when finances were tight or relationships were tense. Her family refused to let her be defined by the man who took her life. Instead, they told stories, stories of her kindness, her determination, how she battled lupus and still built a career, how she stayed up late helping others, how she taught her daughters to be confident, curious, and kind. Shanann lived with intention, and her family made sure the world knew it. One of the most painful parts of the aftermath came not from courtrooms, but from computer screens. In the months following Chris's arrest, countless online forums, YouTube channels, and social media accounts began discussing the case. Some shared theories, some analyzed body language, others, disturbingly, tried to blame Shanann. They said she was too strong, too loud. They scrutinized her parenting, her tone of voice, her success in her job. They ignored the fact that she was the victim. This online cruelty brought new waves of grief for Shannon's family. Her mother spoke out, pleading for empathy. "This was not a movie," she said. "This was my daughter, my grandbabies." They asked for one simple thing: let them rest. Bella Marie Watts was 4 years old, curious, quiet, thoughtful. She loved to sing, to dance, to follow her mother around the kitchen. Her voice was soft and her heart was gentle. Celeste Catherine Watts, known as CC, was 3, energetic, fearless, a little fireball of laughter. She ran before she walked, climbed before she crawled. She filled every room with noise and joy. They were the heartbeat of the Watts family, and in their absence the silence is deafening. Videos of the girls singing with Shanann, hugging their dad, giggling in pajamas, continue to live online, and for many they are too hard to watch. But for others they are reminders that these children were loved, that their lives mattered, and that no one has the right to rewrite that. The Watts case forced people to look closely at something uncomfortable, that domestic violence doesn't always look like bruises or screaming matches. Sometimes it looks like quiet control. A smile hiding withdrawal, a husband who never raises his voice but slowly erases the space for truth in a marriage. Chris Watts never hit Shanann, he never screamed at her, but he lied, he detached, he cheated. And finally, he ended everything without warning, without remorse. Advocates began to speak out. This is why we must believe women. This is why we must recognize emotional abuse. This is why we must check in on the quiet ones. Because by the time someone sees danger, it might already be too late. Chris Watts is now serving 5 life sentences at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. He spends 23 hours a day in his cell. He eats alone, sleeps alone, thinks alone, and as far as the world is concerned, he will never be free again. In prison, he has received letters, some of them from admirers, others from strangers demanding to know why. He's reportedly turned to religion. He writes in a Bible. He answers questions during interviews with dead eyes and soft words, but no matter what he says now, it changes nothing. He made a choice. And 3 innocent lives paid the price. From this tragedy came pain, but also awareness. Schools, therapists, and law enforcement officers now use the Watts case as a teaching tool, not for the horror, but for the patterns. To help people see the signs of emotional detachment, to understand how someone can go from quiet to dangerous, to remind families and friends to check in, even when everything seems fine. We learned that smiles can lie, that people can perform goodness, and that love without honesty can turn into something else entirely. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and unborn baby Nico are gone, but their story has not faded. It lives in every candlelit vigil. Every voice that says, "I will not ignore the signs." Every parent who hugs their child tighter after hearing this story. Their names remind us that no tragedy begins with violence. It begins with silence, with emotional distance, with a decision to lie instead of speak. And that's why their story matters, because the more we tell it with truth, with compassion, with care, the more likely we are to see the signs next time. And stop the silence from turning into something permanent. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people discover the truth. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories that uncover the darkest corners of reality, hit that subscribe button and join us here at Rose and Crimes. Because every voice matters, and every story deserves to be told.